Barron Trump had always been a shadow, tall, silent, composed. While his family made headlines and soaked in the spotlight, Barron stayed back, rarely seen, never heard. No interviews, no social media, just that quiet presence in the background of history. Some called him mysterious, others dismissed him entirely. But no one expected the moment he would finally speak, and certainly not in the way he did. What began as a standard primetime interview with Anderson Cooper turned into something unforgettable, a confrontation that flipped the script, exposed media bias, and redefined what quiet strength really looks like. But the real question is, what happened when Barron Trump seized control of the conversation and left the seasoned journalist stunned? You'll see. Before we begin, help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. If you believe in stories that challenge the mainstream and give voice to the unheard, hit subscribe right now. It means the world to us. It all started with a simple invitation. CNN's flagship show, Anderson Cooper 360 Degrees, had requested Barron Trump for a rare one-on-one interview. The public was confused. Barron? The son who never spoke? Why him and why now? Rumors swirled. Was this the beginning of a political launch? A publicity stunt? Or just a soft-feature attempt to humanize the Trump legacy? Inside the studio, however, things felt anything but soft. The lights were blinding, the air sharp with anticipation. Anderson Cooper, as polished as ever, sat poised with a stack of notes, ready to do what he did best, press hard and push limits. His reputation was built on challenging even the most powerful figures, dismantling narratives with surgical precision. Tonight, he had Barron in his sights. What Anderson didn't realize was that Barron came prepared, not with spin, not with aggression, but with calm, piercing clarity. The opening pleasantries were brief, almost mechanical. Anderson set the stage. Tonight, we're joined by someone who's remained silent for years. A name we all know, but a voice we've never heard, Barron Trump. The camera zoomed in. Barron, now 20, sat upright, composed. No tie, no stiff suit, just a simple blazer, open collar, and an expression that gave nothing away. He greeted Anderson with a polite nod, his voice low, almost melodic. Thanks for having me. Anderson smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he was already a few moves ahead. Let's talk about your mother, he said smoothly, leaning in. Melania Trump, one of the most watched, most critiqued first ladies in recent memory. And yet, she chose silence. She didn't advocate, she didn't campaign, she didn't speak out on politics. Why do you think that is? Was it strength? Or simply convenience? The air in the studio tightened. The audience murmured faintly behind the cameras. This was the moment Anderson had designed, to put Barron on the spot, to challenge him not with aggression, but with insinuation. But Barron didn't blink. Instead, he turned his gaze to Anderson, calm, clear, unmoved, and said, "Silence is not convenience. It's discipline." There was a pause. Not awkward, just heavy, charged. Barron continued, his voice steady. My mother didn't enter the White House to win approval. She didn't need to hold press conferences to prove her worth. Her silence wasn't passivity. It was strength. In a world where everyone is shouting over each other, she chose to listen, to observe, to rise above it. Anderson, slightly caught off guard, adjusted his posture. But do you believe she missed an opportunity? Especially in a time when women are using their platforms more than ever. Barron gave a small smile, almost imperceptible. Opportunity is measured differently by different people. For some, it's a microphone. For others, it's dignity. She chose the latter. For a split second, you could see it, the flicker of uncertainty in Anderson's eyes. He wasn't used to being countered so gracefully. There was no anger in Barron's voice. No defensiveness, just presence. And that presence shifted the energy in the room. Comment below and tell us, what city are you watching from? We love seeing how far these stories reach. Back in the studio, Anderson tried to steer the conversation back toward control. You do realize, he said carefully, that many saw her silence as complicity. That by not speaking, she allowed certain things to go unquestioned. But Barron didn't flinch. People can say what they want, he replied. But I lived with her. I saw what she faced behind closed doors. The mockery, the insults, the pressure to be something she wasn't. Silence wasn't compliance. It was her way of surviving with grace. He leaned forward now, his tone still calm, but with unmistakable steel behind it. The media reduced her to a headline, a caricature, but she is a real person, with real strength. You don't get to erase that because she didn't fit your version of vocal. A wave of stillness passed through the studio. Even the camera operators stopped moving. Anderson exhaled slowly. This was not going the way he expected. Barron Trump, the boy who'd grown up in the shadows of power, was now sitting under the hot lights of scrutiny and dismantling years of narrative with a few measured words. And that was just the beginning. From the moment Barron Trump spoke, the energy in the room shifted. He wasn't just defending his mother. He was reclaiming her humanity. And as the interview unfolded, what many expected to be a moment of discomfort for the young Trump instead became a masterclass in restraint, clarity, and quiet power. This part of the story dives even deeper. What happens when a seasoned journalist finds himself disarmed, not by defiance, but by a voice so measured it leaves no room for rebuttal? Can calm really overpower confrontation? Anderson Cooper was known for his timing. He knew when to press, when to pivot, when to strike. But Barron had neutralized every move with precision. No aggression, no panic, just honesty. And that honesty began cutting through louder than any accusation could. "I want to ask you something else," Anderson said, straightening in his chair. "Your mother was often criticized for being out of touch, distant. She was present at events, but rarely engaged. Some called her cold. How do you respond to that?" Barron took a breath. "You're asking me to explain perception. That's difficult, because perception isn't always reality. It's projection. People saw what they wanted to see. But what I saw was a woman who carried herself with discipline in a space that was never truly hers." He paused, letting the words land. She didn't come from politics. She didn't have a PR team running interference 24/7. She was dropped into a world that expected her to fail. And instead of performing for the cameras, she stayed true to herself. That's not cold. That's courage. The audience behind the scenes, studio staff, producers, even lighting techs, were no longer just doing their jobs. They were listening. Tension had turned into attention. This wasn't politics. This was personal. Anderson tried again, but the rhythm of the conversation had changed. Some say silence allows others to speak for you, that it creates a vacuum that gets filled with false narratives. Would you agree? Barron tilted his head slightly. Only if you're afraid of being misunderstood. But my mother never chased understanding. She didn't beg for approval. She lived her values quietly. And if people chose to twist that, it says more about them than about her. It was a subtle jab, but a powerful one. Not loud, not sarcastic, just pointed. Anderson nodded slowly, but his eyes revealed a flicker of uncertainty. He was running out of angles. "You talk about dignity," he said, "but isn't there a time to speak out, to push back?" And that's when Barron leaned forward slightly, his voice steady and low. "She did push back," he said. "She just didn't do it with noise. She did it with grace. And sometimes that takes more strength." That one sentence lingered in the air. It didn't need volume. It had weight. It was the kind of line that demanded a pause. The kind that settled into the silence and stayed there. If you're enjoying this powerful moment, consider subscribing to our channel. We share stories that challenge assumptions and shine a light on voices that rarely get heard. Anderson Cooper looked down at his notes, then back up, this time with something unfamiliar in his expression. Not frustration, not smugness, something closer to respect. "Was she ever hurt by it?" he asked softly. "The way people talked about her? The jokes, the headlines?" Barron nodded. "Of course. She's human. She felt it all. But she also knew that responding wouldn't change their minds. So she didn't waste time proving herself to people who didn't care to see her. That's not weakness. That's wisdom." It was the first time in the interview that the room felt still, not because of tension, but because of reverence. Even Anderson paused, as if trying to figure out what had just happened. And then Barron said something that shifted the entire tone. "You talk about her like she's a role," he said. "But she's not. She's a woman, a mother, a wife. an immigrant, a survivor of scrutiny no one should ever face alone. And while the world called her silent, I saw her strength in every quiet decision she made. The lights above didn't flicker. The camera didn't shake. But something fundamental had moved. The story had changed. Barron Trump wasn't just answering questions. He was rewriting the narrative. By this point in the interview, it was no longer a back and forth. It was a reckoning. Anderson Cooper had come prepared to dissect a quiet Trump, to unveil contradictions or hypocrisies. But what he encountered was not the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of precision, a silence that spoke louder than the noise. In this part of the story, Barron Trump challenges not only Anderson's questions, but the system behind them, the assumptions, the biases, the games the media plays. The more calmly he spoke, the more everything around him shifted. Anderson cleared his throat. "So you believe the media failed your mother?" Barron didn't answer right away. He glanced around the studio, not out of hesitation, but contemplation. Then, with that same quiet intensity, he replied, "I believe the media never tried to understand her." He leaned back in his chair, composed. They didn't want to understand. They wanted a headline. They wanted her to fit a role. If she spoke, she was mocked. If she stayed quiet, she was accused of being cold. It was never about balance. It was about narrative. Anderson shifted, slightly uncomfortable. "You're saying the press had an agenda?" Barron gave a soft smile. "No, I'm saying they had a template. And when she didn't fit it, they forced her into it anyway." That sentence hit hard. It wasn't accusatory. It was just undeniable. The control Anderson had once held, his pace, his tone, the natural rhythm of his interviews, had been quietly taken from him. And he knew it. But what made it even more remarkable was that Barron never raised his voice, never deflected, never lost control. He simply kept pointing to a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. "Let me ask you this," Anderson said, trying to take a new angle. "When she launched her anti-cyberbullying initiative, many saw it as ironic, given your father's online presence. Did she ever talk to you about that?" Barron nodded. She knew what people thought, but she didn't launch that initiative because it was easy. She launched it because it was necessary. He looked directly at Anderson now. "She once told me, just because others don't live by a principle doesn't mean you abandon it." She wanted help. That was enough for her, and she didn't need applause to validate her work. There was again that calm storm, a wave of conviction wrapped in poise. The audience behind the cameras wasn't just watching, they were feeling every word. If she had been someone else, Barron added, from a different family, with a different last name, would she have been mocked for her accent? Would her fashion choices have been headlines? Or would she have been celebrated for her elegance, her restraint, her grace? It wasn't just a rhetorical question. It was a mirror. Anderson sat up straighter, blinking as if processing the weight of it. "But public figures," he said carefully, "must face scrutiny. That's the cost of visibility." "Scrutiny is fair," Barron answered, "when it's honest. But turning someone into a punchline because she didn't perform the way you wanted, that's not scrutiny. That's personal." His voice didn't rise, but his words cut deep. Anderson paused, longer this time. It was clear he was no longer steering. He was reacting. "If you've made it this far, and this moment has made you think differently, even for a second, then consider subscribing. These stories matter, and we're just getting started." "Do you think your mother regrets taking on that role?" Anderson asked. Barron thought for a moment, then shook his head. "No, because she never took it for granted. She didn't use it for attention. She used it to show people that you don't need to be loud to make an impact." His voice softened. "People think power is about dominating a room. But real power is when you can hold your space without shouting. When you can choose stillness and still be heard." There was a stillness now that wasn't just in the room. It was in the message. A kind of pause that said, something important just happened. Anderson glanced down again. His notes were useless now, because the interview had become something else entirely. It had become a lesson. By now, the studio didn't feel like a news set. It felt like a courtroom, and Barron Trump wasn't on trial. He was delivering the closing argument. A quiet storm had taken over the space, and even Anderson Cooper, one of the most respected voices in journalism, could no longer pretend he had control. In this next part, Barron deepens his challenge, not just to the media, but to the assumptions people carry about grace, silence, and dignity. The question now isn't whether Barron can hold his ground, but whether the media will admit it was wrong. Anderson adjusted his tie, more out of instinct than discomfort. Still, the tension was thick. "So you're saying," he began slowly, "that your mother was judged unfairly, not just because of who she was, but because of who she was married to?" Barron's expression didn't change. He didn't gloat. He didn't flinch. He simply answered, "Yes." Then he added, "She was mocked for her accent, for being foreign, for her fashion, for being too quiet, for being too beautiful, and sometimes just for existing." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. But none of that ever changed who she was. She never lashed out. She never lowered herself to the level of the insults. That takes strength most people don't understand. Anderson leaned forward again. But silence can also be a way to avoid responsibility. Barron nodded. True, but it can also be a refusal to play by broken rules. The camera zoomed slightly. It wasn't directed, it was instinct. The crew behind the scenes knew something important was happening, and they weren't about to miss a second of it. Barron continued. You wanted her to yell back. You wanted her to argue, to pick fights. That would have made it easier to categorize her. But when someone doesn't give you what you expect, you don't get to say they're weak. You have to consider that maybe you misunderstood them from the start. The studio had gone silent. No buzz, no murmurs, just the sound of one young man telling a truth so direct. Even the lights felt warmer for a second. Anderson, for all his experience, was clearly recalibrating. This wasn't going to be a takedown. It was becoming something much harder to achieve, a shift in perspective. She never needed to win people over, Barron added. She just needed to keep her integrity. And she did. If you're still watching and this story has touched you, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment. Every voice matters, and we read every single one. Anderson sat back. His face softened just a little. It wasn't defeat. It was reflection. What did she teach you? He asked almost quietly. Barron hesitated just a beat. Then he smiled faintly. She told me not to let the world define me. That people will try. They'll box you in. They'll twist your story before you even know who you are. But in the end, you decide who you become. He looked straight into the camera, not just at Anderson now, but at every viewer watching. She said, let your silence be your strategy and your strength be your answer. And in that moment, it was clear. This wasn't just a defense of Melania Trump. This was a son reclaiming his family's dignity. Not with a punch. With purpose. Anderson seemed to realize it too. He tapped his pen against the desk, but didn't speak. There was nothing left to ask. Not without losing more ground. Because Barron had already taken it all back. There's a moment in every conversation where the balance of power shifts. And in this interview, that moment had long since passed. Anderson Cooper, usually the one guiding the dialogue, was now following it. And the man leading wasn't a veteran politician or a media mogul. It was Barron Trump, the quietest Trump, the one they all underestimated. This part explores the fallout of that shift. What happens when the expected victim becomes the voice of calm authority? What happens when the silence you once mocked becomes the very thing that silences you? Anderson cleared his throat, a subtle sign that he was now carefully choosing every word. Barron, I think some people are going to hear this and say, okay, that's a nice story. But public life means public critique. Why should Melania or you be exempt? Barron didn't react with offense. Instead, he nodded. We're not asking for exemption. We're asking for fairness. There's a difference. He leaned slightly forward, his voice still smooth and collected. Critique my mother's policies. Critique her choices. But don't mock her accent. Don't reduce her to what she wears or how often she smiles. That's not journalism. That's bullying. The room tightened again. Not with tension this time, but with clarity. Everyone watching understood exactly what he meant. Anderson blinked, as if processing it in real time. You think the media has crossed that line? Barron looked him in the eye. I think the media drew that line and then erased it when it was convenient. A quiet gasp came from somewhere behind the cameras. Someone on the crew had reacted, and no one blamed them. Barron kept going. Look, I get it. People want entertainment. Outrage drives clicks. But the cost of that is forgetting there are real people on the other end of the headlines. My mother wasn't perfect. No one is. But she didn't deserve to be turned into a symbol for everything people hated just because of who she married. That line, just because of who she married, hung in the air like smoke. Anderson rubbed his hands together, thoughtful. Do you think people will listen to you? Or will they just see this as another Trump defending another Trump? Barron didn't hesitate. That's up to them. But at least now they've heard it. For the first time in my voice. It was a stunning admission. He knew he couldn't change everyone's mind. But that wasn't the goal. The goal was to finally speak, and to speak with purpose. To speak for her. I'm not trying to make her into something she's not, he added. I just want people to stop pretending they know her. Because they don't. And if they had taken even a moment to look beyond the headlines, maybe they'd see a woman who carried a heavy weight and did it with grace. Anderson nodded, slowly. His earlier sharpness had softened into something more measured. And then, almost reluctantly, he asked, if you could tell the world one thing about your mother, just one thing, what would it be? Barron paused. He looked down briefly, then back up. That she never needed the world's approval, he said. Just her own. A quiet sigh moved through the studio. Not exasperation, not fatigue, just awe. Barron Trump had walked into the lion's den, and he hadn't roared. He hadn't swung. He hadn't even raised his voice. He simply stood still, and the room moved around him. If this moment made you feel something, if it challenged you, inspired you, or even just made you stop and think, then please consider subscribing. These are the stories we believe deserve to be heard. By now, no one in the studio doubted it. Barron Trump had just delivered one of the most composed, devastatingly honest interviews in recent memory. Not with a spectacle, not with a meltdown, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had spent years in silence, watching, learning, and choosing his moment. In this final part of the story, the interview comes to a close, but the impact lingers. Because once Barron spoke, the world had no choice but to listen. Anderson Cooper, visibly more reflective than combative now, leaned forward with something close to humility. You made your point clearly, he said, and I have to admit, you've done it in a way I didn't expect. Barron didn't gloat. He simply nodded once. That's okay. I didn't come here to win anything, just to speak. There was again, measured, controlled, graceful. Anderson glanced at his notes one last time, then set them aside. I want to ask you something personal, he said. Do you think this moment, this conversation, will change anything? Barron paused. I don't know, he replied honestly. Maybe, maybe not, but at least it will be on the record. That matters more than you think. He looked around the studio, not with arrogance, but with intention. Because for years, the silence around my mother was filled with noise that wasn't hers. This time, we used our own voice. Anderson sat back, nodding slowly. He had no more questions, only acknowledgement. He extended his hand across the desk, and Barron met it with a firm shake. There was no performance in it, no act, just mutual recognition that something real had just taken place. The camera zoomed out, capturing the moment in full. Two figures, one seasoned interviewer, one young man who had come of age in the shadows, and who had now, finally, stepped into the light. As the lights began to dim, Anderson offered his closing line. Tonight, we heard from someone the world thought they'd never hear. And perhaps, we all heard something we weren't ready for. But Barron's last words were the ones that truly echoed. True strength, he said calmly, isn't about how loud you are. It's about how much noise you can face without letting it change who you are. The studio went still, and when the segment aired later that night, the reaction was immediate. Some praised Barron for his composure. Others criticized him, as expected. But no matter where people stood, one truth remained. He had spoken, and the world had listened. Barron Trump's interview wasn't about politics. It wasn't even just about defending his mother. It was about reframing how we view strength, grace, and restraint in an era of constant noise. In a world where shouting often overshadows substance, he reminded us that silence is not weakness, it's strategy. That not reacting isn't passivity, it's power. And most of all, that no matter who you are or where you come from, your dignity doesn't need validation from the loudest voice in the room. So if this story moved you, if it inspired a new way of thinking, click subscribe now. Join our community as we shine a light on the stories that deserve to be heard. And if you haven't yet, click the video card that's on your screen now. We got another incredible story waiting for you. One that'll make you think, question, and maybe even change the way you see the world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.